Okay, I think we're ready to start. This is being recorded on my laptop computer, and hopefully that works well. And it will be posted on the Inland Valley Storytellers YouTube channel.
Wow.
So you can tell your friends if you really enjoy this concert. You can tell them about the YouTube channel, and they can watch and listen to the stories that we're going to do tonight. My name is John St. Clair. I'm the leader of the Inland Valley Storytellers. Welcome. Welcome to the 19th Annual Tellabration concert. And this is our first time doing a live performance since the pandemic started. And so it was kind of an experiment to see how this will work. And I'm delighted that you have decided to join us tonight. And there's a couple things I want to point out on the program. Did everybody get a program? Okay. If you didn't, they're in the back there where you purchase your tickets. On the back page, it has the web address of the Inland Valley Storytellers webpage. And from there is a link to the YouTube channel. And we have resources, for instance, on our resources page, which at the bottom of every page on the website, there is a link to resources. And there are some ongoing resources that are sponsored by the Storytelling Association of California, which we call SAC. And the SAC website has a number of very interesting programs. Among them are monthly genre performances where they pick a category like folk tales or fairy tales or scary tales and get storytellers from all over the state because they're Zoom events. And you can watch them on Zoom, and SAC also has its own YouTube channel, and all of their events are recorded and posted on their YouTube channel, so you can get to them through our webpage by clicking on resources on the bottom. Also, I need to mention that originally Tellabration was used as a fundraiser for the National Storytelling Network. And we've kind of gotten away from that. This group has used it as a fundraiser for our group to pay for the web hosting fee and the domain name registration. And we used to meet monthly and have a room rental. We haven't done that lately because all of our meetings now are on Zoom. And we have every month, the second Tuesday of each month at 7 o'clock, there is a Zoom meeting. And what I have found, COVID has affected us in many different ways. And as a story listener, actually Zoom's not too bad. As a storyteller, it sucks. I really, really miss the audience and the feedback from a live audience. So I'm delighted that you're here and we can have a live event finally. So anyway, there is on the main page, the home page of our website, there's a link to 2 Tellabrations. This is actually our second Tellabration this month. We did a joint Tellabration on Zoom with another storytelling group from Northern California. And that's been recorded and is on our YouTube channel. And also, we have links to both of them. You can read about the storytellers. And if you go to the joint Tellabration page, which is not this one, there are links to the National Storytelling Network if you would like to donate to them. And, the end of the year comes and you need a tax write-off. Well, it's a nonprofit charitable organization. You can deduct a contribution to National Storytelling Network and help support the ancient art of storytelling. So, I think those are the main announcements I had to make. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to read you the Tellabration Proclamation. In the name of storytelling, Saturday, November 20th, 2021, is hereby proclaimed to be Tellabration, the worldwide event of storytelling on this very day in 40 states and 8 countries, from Sacramento to San Antonio, from Boise to Barcelona, West Virginia to West Indies, Las Vegas to Claremont. Over 300 audiences are gathered for this spectacular storytelling event. Without further delay, enjoy, and anticipation, let the stories begin. And our first storyteller is Ron Evans. Now, Ron is from the East Coast, and he and his wife have the distinction of having attended the very first Tellabration ever done, which was done in Connecticut. And that's quite a distinction. In fact, I believe SAC had Ron do a little talk about that last year, because it was quite an interesting distinction. But they moved out here to Claremont. They live in Pilgrim Place, and Ron has been a member of our group for quite a number of years, since 2009. And he tells stories in almost all of our events, and we are delighted to have Ron Evans here tonight. Welcome, Ron Evans.
Let me unmute, first of all. Thank you very much. Delighted to be here. And we certainly have to acknowledge, especially tonight, that Ellen has always been so generous to allow us to add to some life to her lively life place here, but especially with her book out and all, celebrity that she continues to be, and to allow the likes of us in. We thank you all the more, Ellen, for allowing us to be a part. It's important to be in good surroundings, and I hope that we do not, I'm not sure that you'd always like to have the likes of us around, but here we are. Now, having been in the trade myself, and that's a term that is sometimes used for those who have been in the ministry, which is another way of saying that I was once a used Bible salesman. And that gives me some right to complain about people who are especially annoying, who have this interest and desire and almost obsession to have a biblical quote for almost every occasion. Annoying. Particularly one that I have in mind, a gentleman who may have read the Bible at one point or not, I'm not sure, but he always had the quote ready. Children are to be seen and not heard. Fourth acoustiaxis, 15. Or he had another one about everyone will eat broccoli. Sustainability, 1456. I mean, he had a quote for all of these. But then again, it may just be that from time to time, it would be useful to know something that's in the good book and not just know that there is a good book, in addition to Ellen's book, of course. And I think of this in regard to a particular person who lived in the last century, and she, like many people I know, knew the Bible well and knew how to quote it with great care. Her name was Elizabeth Varney, and she was a Quaker maid, lived on a farm in northeastern Ohio. On one fateful, soft, sweet summer evening, too much of a good thing is just about right, especially when it's ice cream, but if you have 3 suitors who come to call on you on the same evening, that could be just a bit much. And so here the 4 of them were seated on the farmhouse front porch. And it was a very calm and lovely evening, and there would be soft conversation, partly because that was the nature of these particular youth. But it's also true that Elizabeth's parents were just a thin screen door away in the parlor. And there were, in the course of this conversation on the front porch, long periods of silence. Unusual for most youth of this day, but in that day, and particularly among friends, Quakers, to have a pause, to be able to consider what is being said, is a part of the nature of the activity. Well, it was an interesting evening and a calm and a lovely one, lubricated by various sips of iced tea and the constant awareness that the parents were just a screen door away. When, during the course of the conversation, the young man whom she most favored reached into his pocket and he pulled forth what I'm sure all of you, not the mask, may have handy. You may have left yours at home, but it was not unusual for Quaker young people to carry around a small Bible, very small print, enormously big ideas, but very, very small print. And flip this open and put his finger on a particular passage in the third letter of John, way in the back of the New Testament. You know the Bible's divided in two parts. There's an Old Testament and a New Testament. You know, the first four books of the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Jack. Well, this is the one that, this comes after that. And he reached in, I'm not sure if I can, well, maybe this would be a little bit more suitable to the size. The print here is just a little larger. And thumbed down to the second letter of John. And the first chapter, it's a very, very short book. In fact, it only has one chapter. But the fifth verse, and he passed this to her so that she could read it silently, of course, and she read as follows. Oh, Penelope, come up here and read it properly for me, if you will, please. It does need really just the right voice. Penelope Mann, who's also a superb storyteller.
Who's never seen this text.
That one right there.
And now I beseech thee, Lady, not though I wrote a new commandment unto thee, but that which we had from the beginning, that we love one another.
Just the right text. Penelope, thank you.
So
Well, the one whom she most favored was just elated when she smiled and with alacrity thumbed a few pages of the same Bible and then closed it, opened it again, and let her finger now slide to the 12th verse of the same chapter. And there, her suitor silently read. David, would you favor us, please?
It would be improvisation. I didn't bring my glasses.
All right, then I will read it on your behalf. And so it was. The 12th chapter. Having many things to write to you, I would not write with paper and ink, but trust to come to you and speak face to face, that our joy may be full. Well, now that is knowing the Bible and knowing how to use it well. Because it wasn't too many days later when that same suitor did come and call upon her parents for the custom of asking for their blessing, that he might then ask for her hand in marriage. And so it was agreed. And so the Quaker meeting of which they were a part accepted this news and took up the responsibility of then having these two young people wed. But there were certain things that had to be fulfilled before that. So 2 committees were named, 2 committees of clearness. That is to say, a committee to meet with her and a committee to meet with him separately to see if there are any encumbrances or there's full sincerity and realization of what this is to entail. And then they went back to the Friends meeting and reported the results of these conversations. And a 3rd committee was now named, the Committee on Arrangements, consisting of 1 member from each of the first 2 committees and 1 person at large. And they were to meet with the parents and the rest of the meeting to decide the occasion, which is known as a meeting for marriage. And so on the fateful day, after a meeting for worship on a Sunday morning, everyone readjusted themselves and there was a meeting for worship. And a long period of silence, and then the 2 young people stood up and faced each other, and he said to her, "I take thee, Elizabeth Varney, to be my wedded wife, and I do promise and covenant before God and these friends to be thy loving husband in joy and in sorrow, in sickness and in health, in worthiness and in unworthiness, in richer or poorer, whatever we may be, for as long as we both shall live." And then the other stood and said the same thing, same name, and then they sat down. And there was another period of silence. Then somebody else stood up and said, "If you are about to enter into this agreement, then you must understand the right definition of marriage. Marriage," this person said, "is 2 people who love each other in spite of how well you may come to know each other," and then sat down. And then another person stood up and said, "And I also have some advice for you. Remember that if you should approach your marriage in a 50-50 arrangement, it probably doesn't have much chance of survival at all. But maybe some slim hope if you begin at 75-75. Well, the wedding took place, the marriage was registered, and so in good time, property was purchased, and a farm evolved out of all of this, and 3 fine children. And these 3 children were all put through college. And of the 3 children who went to college, 1 decided to go on to graduate school because she, the youngest of the 3, wanted to be a teacher. And in time, she was called by Bryn Mawr, a women's college in Pennsylvania, one of the fabled 7 sisters, a school of great high standard. And there she was a teacher for 42 years of biblical literature, wouldn't you know? One wonders what it was that attracted Bryn Mawr to this particular individual. Wonderful teacher, quite knowledgeable, but I think it was her doctoral dissertation that really got their attention. The title of which was Practical Implications in the Epistemology of the Johannine tradition in the latter letters of Practical Alert. Translated, that simply means knowing that there are important parts of the Bible, particularly some of the letters that no one ever reads, where there may be some visit and some great wisdom for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron. That's wonderful. Okay, our next storyteller is Stephanie Towns, and Stephanie was an elementary school teacher for 35 years, the last 6 of which she was a storyteller in residence. And she enjoys telling folk tales, fables, and personal stories, and her mother was a storyteller, and she passed down the love of stories to Stephanie. Please welcome Stephanie Towns.
Yay! so good to be here looking at real people. I am so happy to be here. I am one of the people who has not fared well with the Zoom way of telling stories. It means so much more to me to be able to look around and see people and to interact, to know if you're boring them or you're not. If you need to say a little bit more, add some more. If you can just speed it up because you need to move on. And doing it on Zoom and just sitting there and just was very, very difficult for me. So I'm glad to be here today. And I have to say, I just retired 2 years ago from teaching, so I don't get as many opportunities to tell stories as I did before. And as soon as I got excited about being retired and I finally was going to do it, the pandemic came. And I've been in the house. I retired to be in the house. I am one of those people that has pre-existing conditions, and I'm over a certain age, and all those things that make you feel like you really do have to stay inside. So it felt like I was kind of cut off from the world. No children, no adults, no one to tell stories to. So once I knew that this was coming up, this opportunity was coming, I had a million stories going through my head. I wanted to tell them all. I haven't had a chance. But I just thought that tonight I would share with you the story that the children that I taught for many, many years always loved this story at this time of year. And the name of the story is Stone Soup. Once there were 3 soldiers. Those 3 soldiers were making their way back home from war. They were walking and walking and walking and walking. They were so hungry and so tired they kept thinking, when are we going to come to another town? When are we going to see some people? Maybe we can find a village where someone will offer us something to eat and maybe a place to sleep for the night. There were 3 of them. The first one said, all I want is something to eat. The second one said, I just want to lay down in a nice, comfortable bed. And the third one said, let's keep walking and see what happens. Well, as they walked around the curve, they looked down, and there they saw the lights of a village. And they thought, yes, maybe we'll be able to sleep in a bed and get a meal. And they kept on walking. Now, down in the village, someone had seen them coming and ran down to the village and said, here come some soldiers. More soldiers. Every time soldiers come, they're hungry, they want something to eat, they want a place to sleep. They're always wanting something, and we don't have enough for ourselves. So, after talking amongst themselves, they decided to hide their food. They put their buckets of milk down into the well. They took their quilts and covered all the vegetable bins. They took their beef, hung it on a string, put it down in the basement. They were ready for these soldiers. Well, the soldiers were so happy they couldn't wait to get there, and they knocked on the first door. Finally, the door opened, and a grouchy person said, what can I do for you? We're just 3 weary soldiers. We haven't had anything to eat for days. We would love a place, any place, just someplace where we could lay our heads. And this person said, sorry, we didn't have very good crops this year. We don't have anything to share. Closed the door in their face. Well, they went to the next house. Very pleasant lady opened the door. And she said, hello, what can I do for you? And they said, we are so hungry and weary. We're just looking for something to eat and a place to stay for the night. She said, well, you know, I have 6 children, and I have my father-in-law to take care of, and we just don't have anything extra. Sorry. Closed the door. Well, it turns out that they went from house to house to house to house, and everyone said the same thing. And they were all good reasons. Too many mouths to feed, not a good crop this year, all kinds of reasons. So they finally went to the town square and sat together and thought, what are we going to do? Well, out of one of the houses came a little girl. She came out and she said, hi, what are you guys doing out here? And they said, well, we're really hungry. We know that there's no food in your village, so we thought we would just make a pot of stone soup. Stone soup? Stone soup? Soup made out of a stone? And they said yes. The only thing he said is we just have this little pot. And if we make this little pot, we won't have enough for everyone. It'd be nice if we had a really nice big pot that we could use. The little girl said, my mother has the biggest pot in the village. She went in, she started digging in the cabinet, pulling out things, and her mother asked her what she was doing. She said, I talked to those soldiers, and guess what they're going to make? Stone soup. Well, her parents had never heard of such a thing, and they thought, well, let's go out and talk to them. Maybe this is something we need to know about. So out they went with that great big pot down to the town square and said to the soldiers, if you need a pot, here we have one that we can share you with. So he said, well, in order for us to make it, we need water and a fire. A couple of people came out of some of the other houses and they started bringing wood. They started bringing water, they filled the pot, they got the fire going, and then the soldiers went over to that pot. He went in his pocket, and he came out with a nice, smooth stone. Dropped it in the pot and gave it a stir. Now, by this time, almost all the people in the village had came out to see what was going on. And someone said stone soup, and they all couldn't believe it. Stone soup, a soup made from stone. So they wanted to see what was going on. Well, the soldiers took turns stirring, and one of them said, you know, you can't ask for something that you don't have, but this soup would really taste good if it had a few carrots in it. But we won't ask you for something that you don't have. Well, I think that I might have a few carrots. So, in ran the mother. She went under that quilt that she had covered all of her vegetables with, and she got out some carrots. She came out with an apron full. She ran out, and they put all the carrots into the pot. And the next soldier took his turn to stir. He said, this is starting to smell mighty good. But you know, I think it would be even better if it had a few potatoes. Now, we won't ask you for something we know you don't have any, but sure would taste good. Well, one of the farmers went over and he said, just let me check inside and see. He went in and when he came out, he had a whole armload of potatoes. And he brought them over and in went those potatoes. Well, one person went in and got something else. They came out with some onions. In went the onions. Someone else went in and came out with some turnip. Put those in. Then the third soldier took his turn to stir, and he was, this is the best smelling soup. I think we're outdoing ourselves this time. He said, but you know, a little salt and pepper would really give it a good taste. Now the little girl ran inside and she came back out with a bag of salt and a little bit of pepper, threw it in there. My goodness, did that soup smell good. Before they knew it, those soldiers started to tell them about the time that they had made this exact same stone soup for the king. This is a soup fit for a king. Well, all the people in the village were looking at each other. You mean they made the soup for the king? Oh my goodness, this is going to be the best. One of the farmers went into his closet and down into his cellar, came back up with a big roast. Brought that piece of meat, put it in, and they continued to stir. Well, everyone in the village could smell the aroma of that soup. They could see that everybody was feeling really hungry. And so the soldiers said, it's just about ready. But if we're going to all eat together, we need tables, because there's enough for everyone. Well, everyone came out. They had tables, they had chairs, they had dishes, bowls for soup. Someone even brought out some cider, a loaf of bread, and they all sat down and had stone soup. There was enough for everyone in the village to eat as much as they wanted. Before you know it, they had eaten and eaten and eaten, and they had enjoyed themselves so much they weren't ready to end the evening, so they went and got out the instruments, and they all began to play music and dance and sing together, and that village had the best time spending their time together, sharing a meal with each other. It had been so long since they had each came out and joined each other. Well, finally, they were ready to go to bed. The other soldiers said, well, I guess we'll get going now. And they said, oh no, such special soldiers as you who could come up with such a delicious meal, you should sleep in the best houses in the village. So someone slept with the baker's house, someone else slept at the priest's house, someone else slept at the did I say baker? 3 houses, the best houses in town. They got to sleep there for the night. They had a good night's rest. They slept with full tummies. And when they got up in the morning and they got ready to leave, the whole village came out to see them off. They thanked them for such a wonderful meal, for a wonderful evening, for bringing them all closer together. And they left them the stone and told them, now this little village, when you have a bad crop or you're really struggling, you'll never go hungry because you can always make stone soup.
Thank you, Stephanie. That was wonderful. Okay, the next storyteller is Ray Kraut. And Karen has been telling stories since 1990. She went to East Tennessee State College and earned a master's degree in storytelling. And she has been a member of the Inland Valley Storytellers since 2005, and she tells stories to various audiences all over Southern California, and probably lately we've been doing some Zoom stuff too. Please welcome Ray Kraut.
Thank you so much. John, can you help me? Oh, maybe this will be okay.
Is that good?
All right, yes. I'm weeping with joy. It's so wonderful to see all of you. And I realized when I was driving over here tonight that this story that I've been dying to tell you, I told this story for the very first time 30 years ago, right here at the Folk Music Center when Dorothy Chase had a storytelling group. Oh my gosh. So I feel so honored to share it with you again. I learned this from a really amazing storyteller. I hope he's okay. Doug Lippman, he's based in Boston. And then I liked this story so much that I also did some research, and you can find it in a book of folk tales from Israel, edited by Dov Noy. But it's so interesting. It's folk tales from Israel, but in the introduction to the story, Dov Noy says, this story comes from Afghanistan. So there you have it. This story comes from Afghanistan via Israel, via Doug Lippman. And it goes like this. Once there was a king, and he was a wise king. He loved his people. But you know, when you're the king, people don't always tell you the truth. So he finally came, you know what I'm talking about, right? Yes. So finally he came up with a strategy. He would go out disguised as a dervish, and he would walk among the people of the capital city of his country and talk to them just to find out what they really thought. And he especially loved to go to the very outskirts of the city and talk to the poorest people to find out what were their struggles and what did they need. So one night he was wandering out in the outskirts of the town in a place he had never seen before, and he saw a tiny, tiny little rundown cottage, obviously very poor. And you'd think from such a cottage there would be no sounds of joy, but coming from the windows he could hear somebody was singing. Chitty beam, chitty boom, chitty beam boom, beam boom, bitty boom, chitty beam, chitty boom, chitty beam boom, bitty boom. He was intrigued. He went, he peered in the window, he saw a young man eating and drinking cheerfully. And so he knocked on the door and called out, "Is the stranger welcome?" And the young man said, "A stranger is God's gift. Come in, come in." And so he sat down at the table with the young man, and they had a wonderful conversation. The young man shared his meal. He was just as generous as those soldiers with their stone soup. And they talked of many, many things. And the young man shared many wise sayings that he had learned from his old mother. And he said, "Oh, I miss my dear mother. And I tried to live with her advice every day." So the king said, "Well, what do you do for a living?" "Well, I'm a cobbler." "Oh, you have a shop?" "No, I couldn't afford a shop, but I go through the streets each day with my box of tools, and I repair people's shoes as they need them repaired." The king said, "Can you make enough money doing that?" "Well, each day I make just enough money to buy food for that day. Isn't that wonderful?" But don't you worry that someday you won't make enough and you won't have any food to eat?" "Well, my mother always said, it is the heart that is important, day by day." Well, the king said goodnight to the man, and he walked back to the palace, thinking, "I'm going to put this young fella's philosophy to the test." And the next morning, what did the king do? But he issued a proclamation that anyone wandering and cobbling shoes without having their own shop would have to get a permit, and a permit would cost 25 pieces of gold. Now let's see what kind of song he's going to sing. So the king disguised himself again that night, and he walked back to that far corner of the town, and he knocked on the door. "Is a stranger welcome?" "A stranger is God's gift. Come in." So he walked in, and there was the young man, eating and drinking just as he had been the night before, full of good cheer. "Oh, cobbler, I was worried about you when I heard about that proclamation of the king." The cobbler said, "Yes, so was I. But I remembered my mother's advice. It's the heart that is important, and I deserve to survive, and so I will." And you know what I did? No, I want to know. Well, I went out and I looked for some people, and I saw a lot of people walking toward the king's forest. And I asked them, "Where are you going? Well, we're going to the king's forest to gather firewood. Oh, can I go too? Sure, the king's forest is large. Come with us. So I went to the king's forest. I gathered firewood all day, and I sold it in the village for just enough money to buy food for today. The king said, but what about tomorrow? What about next week? What about the week after that? I told you my mother's wise advice. It's the heart that is important, day by day. So the king went back to the palace. And the next day, he issued a new proclamation. Anybody caught gathering firewood in the king's forest would be immediately inducted into the royal guard, and they wouldn't be paid for 30 days. Well, that night, he went back. He couldn't wait to see how the cobbler was going to handle this. But when he got close to the house, the singing! He heard the singing again. Chitty beam, chitty boom, chitty beam boom, beam boom, bitty boom. But this time it had another, even more cheerful and lively part. I chitty bitty 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 boom. Oh my goodness! And then there came a part that was martial and determined. I chitty bitty 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 boom. Oh my goodness! He knocked on the door. Is a stranger welcome? A stranger is God's gift. Come in. Well, he walked inside. Oh, my friend, when I heard that proclamation of that wicked king, I was so worried about you. You were worried. I was very worried. But once again, I remembered my mother's advice. Do you know what they did? First, they pulled me out of the forest. They put me to march back and forth in the royal guard. They told me I wouldn't be paid for 30 days. They gave me a sword and a belt and a scabbard to put it in. But as I marched all day, I was thinking about my mother's advice. What would she do in this situation? And then I realized that metal sword blade would be valuable. Well, I have a little skill at woodworking, so I made another blade out of wood. I took that metal sword blade off of the handle, I put the wooden blade in, put it in the scabbard. When it's in, you can't even tell when it's in there. And you know, I sold that metal sword blade for just enough money to buy food for today. So please join me. Let's have a good meal together. Oh my goodness, the king said, this is it. I know just what I'm going to do. He went back to the palace, and the next day, the cobbler, marching back and forth in the king's guard, found himself pulled out of line, and the captain of the guard presented him with a trembling man in chains. Who was it? Captain. The captain of the guard said, Cobbler, you are to take this man who has committed a terrible crime to the town square, and using your sword, you are to cut off his head. Oh no, I couldn't do that. I'm a man of peace. I could never take another human life. If you don't, you will both be executed. What could the cobbler do? He took the poor trembling man. He pulled him up on his feet, and the two of them walked toward the town square. A huge crowd had gathered to witness the execution. He gently placed the man on the ground. He kind of walked back and forth. You could see he was thinking very hard. And then he stopped. And then he stood up straight. And he looked out at all the people who were assembled there. And he said, I, good people, am no murderer. If this man is guilty, let my sword be as always. But if he is innocent, let it magically turn to wood. Then he put his hand on the sword blade, and with a great flourish, he pulled it out of the scabbard, and the crowd gasped. You can show it if you want to. Let's try it. At the great miracle they had witnessed. And then from out of the crowd stepped the king. He looked the cobbler in the eye and he said, "Oh, cobbler, I give up. There's only one thing I can do right now. You must come and live with me in the palace. Be one of my advisors. Teach me how to live the way you do, one day at a time." And do you know what they did right there? The king and the cobbler, they took hands and they danced and sang. And I think we could try that right now. Shall we just try it? How about anyone who wants to, just stand on up and you could sing along with me. It just goes like this. Chitty beam, chitty bom, chitty bim bom, biddy bom, chitty beam, chitty bom, chitty bim bom, biddy bom. I chitty bitty 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 bom. I chitty bitty 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 bom. Oh, you were amazing! That was amazing! Oh, you're very good dancers too. Thank you so much. Thank you, Doug Lippman. All right, now I have the honor of introducing our next storyteller and musician. And I couldn't resist. I just embellished the intro a little bit. So Ellen Harper has been around. I've got to say, I have to give credit. Some of this is from NPR. Some of it is from Ellen's website. But it was so good, I had to share it. Okay, Ellen Harper has been around the folk music scene her whole life. Her parents, Dorothy, Dorothy and Charles Chase were the creators and the heart and soul of this amazing folk music center, which they opened in 1958. Ellen learned to play, perform, and teach guitar and other folk instruments at her mother's knee. Ellen collaborated recently, in 2014, on an album, Childhood Home, with her amazing son, Ben Harper, a Grammy Award-winning singer and songwriter. And her new memoir, which you can see up at the front, I myself am buying a copy tonight, called Always a Song, tells her personal story, as well as the story of growing up surrounded by the luminaries of the folk music revival of the 50s and 60s. My biggest thrill was hearing Ellen and Ben interviewed by my hero, Terry Gross, on public radio's Fresh Air. Wow! Ellen currently runs the Folk Music Center, the Claremont Folk Festival, and teaches music classes. Now let's welcome Ellen, accompanied by Jerry O'Sullivan, with the story song, "Okay to L.A." Yay!
Well, after that introduction, I might as well just say hello and see you later. So this is a song I wrote not too long ago called "Okay to LA." OK being Oklahoma, LA being LA.
this one you have not recorded yet, not
No, it's not. Well, no.
okay, so it's kind of new,
Kind of new.
unreleased.
Thank you so much for coming out. It's so, I don't know, strange but exciting. This is the first event, I guess, that we've had here since February of 2020. Yeah. Getting used to being out in the world.
Yeah, and we've all done things in recent months that have added some normalcy, I guess. We've been to events maybe and stuff, but this to me is strange in a good way. But tonight we used to do events. I mean, I've worked here almost 17 years, and so we've done so many of these events, and this is the first one. So to see a lot of you have been here before to Tellabration, and to see a lot of you, yeah, it's like it was on pause, and then someone just took the pause button off. It was on pause for 2 years, it's a long time. So it's great to see everybody, but it's odd. It's a little odd, but like I said, odd in a good way. I'm not freaked out. So thank you.
And I want to thank John for asking me to come in and do something for you guys. So thank you, John. Ready?
Yeah.
She's going back to Oklahoma. Gotta take care of Daddy and Mama. Leaving the home she made in LA. Flying back to live in the Great Plains. Oklahoma couldn't claim her. Didn't fit in with any of her neighbors. She left town. Who could blame her? California welcome stranger. What she gonna find back in Oklahoma? What she gonna miss about California? Who'll take care of Daddy and Mama? Gotta get back to Oklahoma. Can you take the girl out of the country that put her back in Cimarron County? Left coast friends tell her she's crazy, but Mama and Daddy counting on their baby. So she's going back to Oklahoma. Mama cried the minute she told her now. Looking back over her shoulder, she's starting a life she thought was over. And what you gonna find back in Oklahoma? What you gonna miss about California? Who'll take care of Daddy and Mama? Gotta get back to Oklahoma. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, guys. That was fun.
And an honor. Thank you for having us here.
Thank you, Ellen and Jerry. That was wonderful. Okay, our next storyteller is Nick Smith. Now, Nick Smith has been telling stories for a long, long time, but he also is very much involved with the folk music scene and is has in the past, although it's been on hiatus because of COVID, but in the past has run a series of folk music concerts at Caltech that we love to go to. And he's been involved with solstice celebrations, both in dealing with folk music and storytelling. Used to run a storytelling group in Pasadena, which is no longer in existence, but we have been very, very privileged to have him, who lives over there in the Pasadena area, be a regular member of our group and given us much wisdom from his past experience, and we'd love to hear his story. So please welcome Nick Smith.
Sorry, I need to wet my whistle a bit. Now, I have to explain to you that my entry into storytelling came from my day job, because starting in the late 1980s, part of my job became doing stories for kids. And I wanted to learn how to do that better, not just read a book to them. And so I began visiting storytelling groups and taking storytelling workshops and attending storytelling festivals. And it very quickly became part of my life, which in turn led to researching stories and finding ways to tell stories. And this story in particular comes from that combined with one of my peculiar hobbies. You see, I'm a Robin Hood buff. Ever since I was a kid and first saw one of those TV shows of Robin Hood, I thought, you know, this is kind of a cool story. And it wasn't until I learned to do things with stories that that mattered, because coming back from a storytelling concert, I was visiting a used bookstore in Pasadena because I walked right by there on my way home. And the person who was working there that night came rushing up to me and says, "You've got to see this." Burl Ives was selling off his research collection very late in his life, and for some reason, this store in Pasadena was one of several stores around the country that was selling off this research material. As a result, I ended up with a copy from Burl Ives' own collection of songs from Norman, England, and they had songs about Prince John, and none of them were favorable to Prince John. Apparently, he spent hundreds of years having people write songs saying how much they disliked him. Later, I found that one of the child ballads was also about him after he'd become king. And they didn't like him either. And so it was that I thought, you know, this is really an interesting story. Maybe I should tell it sometime. And this last year, because of COVID, I was asked to do videos of a bunch of folk tales for a local cable access channel, and then our library would be able to use them as YouTube videos. And much to my astonishment, this was the story that was the most viewed. And after a year, I finally found out why. Apparently, I'm one of only 2 storytellers who tells this story, or who's done it in a way that's recorded on YouTube. And so people who are looking at the song and wanting to learn the story go to either this other storyteller's version, which is 20 minutes long, or mine, which is a bit shorter because I have slightly fewer digressions. And so this is the story of King John and the Abbot of Canterbury. You see, in the days of King John, he was ruler of a nation, but not a popular ruler, shall we say. Whereas the Abbot of Canterbury, people loved him. He was kind, he was generous. One of the things he did was when people donated money to his abbey, he would spend it on things that would help the future of the people surrounding the abbey. And so it was that when they got extra donations, the abbey purchased farmland that would grow food that could be used when it was needed. They had meadows where sheep were kept and a shepherd hired to take care of them for those times when it was needed. And when men came back sick or injured from the crusades that the previous king, Richard, had gotten the nation involved in, there was a place for them to go to recover if they needed to recover, to eat when they needed a place to eat, to rest when they needed a place to rest. And so it was that the popularity of the Abbey at Canterbury became greater because the soldiers would come there, and they knew that they would find good company and a good meal. And so it was that frequently he had larger dinner tables than the king himself. And the king was not happy. The king heard this and said, "I believe we shall have a talk with the Abbot of Canterbury." And so it was that he sent for the abbot, and the abbot came to meet with the king, and the abbot was faced with a scowling monarch. And the king said, "I have heard that you have a richer table and a bigger company at your dinners than my own royal table provides. Is this true?" And the abbot said, "Well, it's only because of the soldiers coming back from the wars and..." "Well, so you're saying that it's my brother's fault, eh?" No, that's not what I meant. You see, it's just that, well, people come there because we've been kind and generous and they'd like to come back and visit. Are you saying that I, your king, am not kind or generous?" "Well, no, that's not exactly what I meant either, Your Highness. But you see, let me explain to you. If I decide that what you have been doing is treasonous, you could, in fact, lose your head in an unfortunate manner. So, I will give you an opportunity to avoid that fate. I will let you answer 3 questions, and if you answer those 3 questions, your dinner table is safe." "Well, I will attempt to answer them, sire." "Very well, then. My first question is, measured however you want, where is the most central place on earth?" And the abbot said, might I have some time to think on this, sire?" Of course, you can have an entire week." The second question is, how long would it take for me to ride my horse all the way around the world? I need a little bit of time on that one too, sire." Fine. The third question, and you will answer this at the time you answer the others. Tell me then, as your third answer, what I am thinking at the moment you answer that question. "All right," said the abbot. I don't know that I can answer those, but I will make the attempt." And so he sadly went home, and walking back to the abbey, he encountered the shepherd that was taking care of the sheep there. And his sad expression got the attention of the shepherd, and the shepherd said, "Abbot, what's wrong?" And the abbot explained that the king wanted either his head or the answers to 3 questions, and he didn't have any idea what any of the questions even meant or how they could be answered. And then the shepherd thought and said, "Well, I'm not as grand or as wise as either a king or an abbot, but let's see if we can come up with an idea. Let me go in your stead, dressed as you." If it's King John, he probably wasn't paying much attention to what you look like anyway. And so the abbot, after much persuasion, let the shepherd go in his stead a week later. And so the shepherd went to the king, dressed as the abbot, and King John said, "Are you ready to answer my questions?" And the shepherd, in his most abbot-like voice, said, "I'll try, your highness." And King John said, "First, measured however you like, where is the centermost place in the entire world?" Well, the shepherd looked, and he looked around the hall and looked at where the king was seated, and he says, "About there in front of your left foot." Well, King John said, "What? How could that be the centermost place on earth?" And the shepherd said, "Well, if you doubt me, you can measure it yourself." And the king thought to himself and said, "That's a good answer," not wanting to measure the entire world and figure that out himself. And he said, "But the second question, of course, is very important. How long would it take me to ride a horse around the world?" And the shepherd said, "I'll tell you what. Get up early tomorrow morning to get your horse ready. And I want you to be prepared for this. And when the sun rises enough over your shoulder that you can see your shadow and the horse's shadow in front of you, ride as fast as you can so that the sun stays in the same position behind you, and I'll guarantee that after one day you'll have gone around the entire world and be back home." And the king said, "But I don't have a horse that could run that fast." And the abbot said, "That wasn't the question you asked. Unfortunately, I can't guarantee the quality of your horses." And the king thought to himself and said, "That is another very wise answer. But now you have to answer the third question. What am I thinking?" And the shepherd said, "That's the easiest of all. You're thinking that I'm the Abbot of Canterbury. But instead, I'm only his shepherd who guards his flocks." And the king, for the first time in quite a while, began to laugh, because that was not the answer he was expecting, and yet it was a legitimate answer. And when he saw that it was not, in fact, the abbot, it was a very funny answer as well. And so he said, "You are so much wiser than any man I have ever encountered. You should be the abbot in place of the man who is now." And the shepherd said, "Oh no, sire. I can't even read the book myself. I could never preach from it." And the king said, "In that case, I'll give you a reward of another kind. You shall have a steady income from this point forward. Whether you take care of the abbot's sheep or not, you'll live well from the king's treasury." And the shepherd went home and told the abbot, "I think your head is safe now," and proceeded to give the money he didn't need to the money that the abbot gathered for the care of those soldiers coming home from the wars, and went back to taking care of the sheep. Because after all, he wasn't an abbot, only a shepherd. Now I'd like to introduce to you our final teller of the evening. You've seen him coming up here, but not as a teller, and it's as a teller that I first met him a number of years ago. John Sinclair has been a member of the Inland Valley Storytellers for, 18 years now, something like that. And not only is his heart in storytelling, but he is at the heart of the group that puts on these shows and the other things that we do, because he's the organized one of us. And more importantly, he's the sort of person who brings stories to us that you might never have thought of hearing as a story, because they're ones that you might see on the pages of a book, but not think to tell yourself. Ladies and gentlemen, John Sinclair.
Thank you, Nick. So I'm going to tell you a folk tale from Serbia. Long ago, there was a king whose wife, the queen, was ready to deliver a baby, their first child. In fact, she was in labor in their bedroom, and this poor king was pacing back and forth, worried about the health of the queen, about the health of the baby. Would it be a boy? Would it be a girl? Finally, the door opened, and the midwife stuck her head out and said, "Your Majesty, you have a brand new baby boy." But the king didn't wait to hear the rest of what the midwife was going to say. He rushed into the room, and there in the bed was the queen, and she was holding up the baby, and she said, "It's a beautiful baby boy," but the king didn't wait to hear what the queen had to say. He took the baby and looked at him, and he smiled. He was so happy, such a handsome face, so healthy looking. And the baby was all wrapped up in blankets, and the king moved the blanket off the baby's head. He was curious to see if the baby had any hair, because, you know, some do and some don't. And his smile disappeared, and he was shocked. The midwife said, "Your Majesty, things like this sometimes happen, and probably the boy will outgrow them." Well, the them that she was talking about were two very large ears. And the king said, "This is not good. People will laugh at him with ears like a donkey. How will they ever respect him when it's his turn to become king? How will they ever obey someone that looks so comical that they laugh at?" And so the king and the queen plotted what to do. They decided no one would ever see the boy's ears. And the first thing they did is they gave the midwife a very large bag of gold coins and sent her off to a faraway place where she could live comfortably for the rest of her life and never tell a soul about the baby's large ears. Then they decided that no one would care for the baby except the queen and the king. And so the queen would bathe the baby and feed the baby. And this was quite unusual for royalty to take a personal touch with the upbringing of their children, because usually that was pawned off to someone else. But they didn't want anybody else to know. That was the only way they could guarantee to keep the secret. And unfortunately, the midwife was wrong. As the boy grew, so did his ears. And so when he was 6, they fitted him with a crown that was specially made to hide the ears. And as he grew, they made bigger crowns because the ears continued to grow. And he actually grew up to be a fine young man. He had a very handsome face. He was strong. He was smart. He was kind. And no one knew that he had the ears of a donkey. Well, this worked out very well. The queen continued to care for him. He didn't need as much care as he did when he was a baby, of course, but she cut his hair because the royal barber was not allowed to see the boy, because in order to cut the hair, you'd have to notice the donkey ears. And so the queen would cut his hair, and it worked out fine until the king and queen died, and it was this young man's turn to become king. And that worked out fine, except not only were his ears still growing, but so was his hair. and his mother was no longer around to cut the hair. So the king called for the royal barber and went into a private room, and he took off his crown, which was hiding his ears, and the royal barber was startled, but he recovered, and he cut the king's hair. And then the king said, "Now, do you notice anything unusual about me?" And the barber kind of hemmed and hawed, and finally said, "Well, your Majesty, I couldn't help but notice that you have the ears of a donkey." The king took out his sword and chopped off the man's head. And he had his guards take the body and the head off to the forest to bury somewhere. Well, the king's hair didn't stop growing. And so, in another month or two, his hair was starting to get long, and they had found another royal barber to cut the hair of everybody else in the royal court, and the king summoned the barber, and the same thing happened. And this continued to happen every couple of months until there was only one barber left in the whole kingdom. And it was an old man, an old barber, who had a 13-year-old boy as his apprentice. And on the day that he was summoned to go cut the king's hair, that old man became very sick. And he told the boy, "I can't go. I just can't do it. You go in my stead." And the boy said, "Are you sure?" And he said, "I've trained you well. You can do it. You can cut the king's hair." So the 13-year-old boy packed up the barber tools in a bag, and he went to the king's palace and told the guards he was there to cut the king's hair, and the guards were very sad because they had seen many barbers go in. They had never seen one come out. And so the young boy went to the king's quarters, and the king was surprised to see a boy, and he said, "Do you know how to cut hair?" And the boy said, yes, I've been very well trained. I can cut your hair." And so the king said, "All right." And he took off his crown, and of course the ears popped out. And the boy thought they were marvelous. In fact, it reminded him of a story he had heard about warriors whose ears would grow every time they did an act of bravery. Every time they slayed a dragon or rescued a damsel, their ears would grow a little bit. And so he cut the king's hair, and when he finished, the king said, "Now, do you notice anything unusual about me?" And the boy smiled, and he said, "No, your Majesty, I think you look wonderful with your haircut." And the king smiled, and he said, "If you keep our little secret, you will keep your head." And the boy knew what he was talking about. So it worked out quite well. He was the royal barber for the king only. They had to have another barber that, I don't know where they got it from, but somehow they had to have another barber cut other people's hairs in the royal court. And the boy was the king's personal barber, and the king grew to like the boy. And he started to confide in the boy about problems and decisions to make that dealt with people in the kingdom. And the boy always answered truthfully and thoughtfully, and felt very flattered that the king wanted to know his opinion. Well, have you ever tried to keep a very important secret that you could tell no living soul? It took a toll on the boy. He was afraid he might accidentally say something that would give away the fact that the king had the donkey ears. And the stress took a toll on him, and he became sickly, and finally he was bedridden. And his old mentor friend, the old barber, came to visit him and said, "My son, what is the matter?" And the boy said, "Well, I have a secret that I can't tell a living soul." And the barber said, "Oh, you can trust me. You can tell me your secret." "No," said the boy, "if I tell you, we'll both lose our heads." "Oh, then forget it," said the barber. You don't have to tell me. "You could tell the priest." And the boy said, "No, I cannot tell a living soul." And then the barber thought, and he said, "You know what? My mother once told me that if I had a deep, dark secret I didn't feel comfortable telling anyone, I should go out into the forest and dig a hole and tell the earth the secret. And the boy thought, what have I got to lose? In fact, just hearing that there might be a solution made him feel better. So the next morning he got up early and he got a shovel, he went out into the forest, and he dug a hole in what looked like an appropriate spot, and he got down on his hands and knees and he said into the hole, "The king has the ears of a donkey." And then he put the dirt back in, covered it up, and it was magical. It was as if the burden had been lifted from his shoulders. He felt better immediately. It was magical. And he went back to the palace. Well, that night, something else magical happened. A willow tree grew out of that hole. And it grew all night long until it was a full-grown willow tree. And the next morning, children went into the forest and they were hunting for a willow tree that they could cut off branches and whittle into little whistles. And they saw this tree. It was wonderful. And so they did that. And they came in and they sold the whistles in the city where the palace was. The only problem was when you blew on the whistle, it didn't play a little tune. It sang a song. The king has the ears of a donkey. The king has the ears of a donkey. The king has the ears. The king has the ears. The king has the ears of a donkey. Well, the king was sitting at his window, and he heard that, and he was furious. And he told the guards to go fetch the barber. And so the guards brought the boy back, and the king said, "How could you betray me like that? I trusted you." And the boy said, "Your Majesty, I didn't tell a living soul. All I did was dig a hole and whispered the secret into the hole and covered it up because I couldn't bear keeping it inside any longer." And the king said, "Show me." And so the two of them went out into the forest, and the boy went to the place where he had dug that hole. And he said, "I don't believe it. There was no tree there yesterday. It was just bare ground. That's why I dug the hole there." And so the king took out a knife and he cut off a branch and he whittled it into a little whistle and he blew on it. And it didn't make a tune. It said, "The king has the ears of a donkey. The king has the ears of a donkey. The king has the ears. The king has the ears. The king has the ears of a donkey." And the king thought, and he looked at the boy, and he thought not just with his brain, but with his heart. And he realized that the boy had not betrayed him, that he had put a terrible burden on that young boy to keep that secret. And he realized that wasn't fair. And he realized the boy really was loyal to him. And he also realized it was time for him to stop living the lie. And so he took off his crown and the ears popped out and he carried the crown, and the two of them walked back to the city and back to the palace, and people saw the king with the donkey ears, and some of them smiled, some of them chuckled and snickered, but not too loudly. They didn't want the king to hear. And it turned out that they still respected the king. And he had been a wise and just king, except for the fact that he had created quite a few widows of the barbers. And so the king continued to rule the kingdom quite well, with kindness and with justice. And he took the boy in. The boy continued to cut his hair, but he also made him an official advisor because he really valued the thoughtfulness and the truthfulness of this boy, who grew up to be a man. And the king never had any children. And so when he became old, he made sure that everyone knew that he wanted his top advisor, this barber, to become the new king. And indeed, he did. He took over. And he was also a wise and just king. And he had learned a valuable lesson about about the importance of what's inside of a person, not what their outward appearance is. And the king, by having the courage to let the people know the truth, had taught an important lesson to the whole kingdom, to everybody in the kingdom. And the fact that they all realized it's the inner character that counts, not the outward appearance. That helped everybody live happily ever after. The king's ears. Well, that concludes the evening, and I want to remind you, don't throw away your program, because that's got that important web address on it that you can go to our website and you can look at the resources and read about. I happen to have the skill to know how to make web pages, so there's a little web page for each storyteller from both Tellabrations. You can read about the storytellers, and be sure to check out the resources link that has all the Storytellers Association of California links on it as well. And when the end of the year comes and you need a bigger charitable deduction on your taxes, remember the National Storytelling Network and think of storytelling, and let's all continue to work to keep the art of storytelling alive. Thank you very much.